Hello everyone. It has been 5 months since I made an Oilers video. It's amazing to me how fast the time seems to be passing. And I wish that I was as excited about this as my son is.
January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, December.
At any rate, this is easily the longest amount of time I've ever gone between Oiler videos since I started creating them. I'll get more into that at the end, but for now, I've got a ton of content to cover. Let's start all the way back with the playoff loss to Chicago. Now, when the NHL returned to play, I knew there were going to be a handful of teams that got burned by the restructuring of the season. I just hoped the Oilers wouldn't be one of them. Well, you could make a pretty solid argument that they got burned worse than any other team. First of all, the Oilers were the only top 2 divisional team in the league not to be given a bye to the playoff round. Shifting the goalposts on the playoff qualifications put the Oilers in a position where the work they had done to secure the second place seed during the season was nullified. Now, had the season not been interrupted, I don't think this really would have been an issue. But the fact that they had to pause for 4.5 months made it into a bit of a problem. There were a number of teams, all good ones, that simply couldn't manufacture playoff intensity at the beginning of August. Among them, Boston, St. Louis, Washington, Pittsburgh, and Toronto. Unfortunately, the Oilers, Penguins, and Maple Leafs didn't have the luxury of 3 extra warm-up games before the do-or-die ones started. Ironically, the team that was given a bye in the Western Conference instead of the Oilers, the Dallas Stars, went 1-2 in their round robin, being outscored 10-5. They then lost their first game against the Flames. So, just like the Oilers, they went 1-3 to start, but that little bit of extra runway certainly seemed to help them as they ultimately came within 2 wins of the Cup. Secondly, the reason the play-in round was established, aside from recovering lost revenue, was that the NHL refused to prorate team performance over the 82-game schedule. Despite the fact that teams like Chicago and Montreal had a combined 2.6% chance of making the playoffs, the league could not be certain that the Oilers would not lose all 11 of their remaining games and fall out of the race. They couldn't rule out that possibility. They were, however, completely confident that James Neal would score at least 2 more goals, and Milan Lucic would not score 3 more. This bizarre, arbitrary ruling means that the Oilers will surrender a 3rd-round pick to the Flames in next year's draft. And third, the COVID pause basically wiped out the return on one of the Oilers' deadline acquisitions. Mike Green played 2 games for the Oilers before getting injured and then opted out of playing in the fall tournament. That 2 games of Mike Green cost the Oilers a 4th-round pick. So when the dust settled in the middle of August, the Oilers were virtual golfing and down a couple of mid-round draft picks. Now, I'll be honest with you, I was not all that upset that the Oilers got knocked out of the play-in round. I wrote about this on Twitter, but it just didn't feel like playoff hockey to me. The combination of it being summertime and no crazy fans in the stands and the complete lack of physicality or intensity in the series, I just couldn't get invested. And it wasn't just the Oilers series I felt that way about, it was the tournament in general. I spot watched some of the other games, and I remember numerous times they would go 5 or 6 minutes without a stoppage, and they would put a graphic up on the screen saying how long it had been since somebody had a shot on goal. Not exactly riveting playoff action. Now, I'm not trying to rip on the league here. I think they did a good job, especially under the circumstances, but it just didn't feel like playoffs to me. Now, you'll have to forgive me, but I paid very little attention to the NHL draft this year, and by very little, I mean none. And I think this is a good sign. It seems that gone are the days where I'm banking all of my hopes and dreams for the upcoming season on a fresh-faced 18-year-old kid out of the Canadian Hockey League. All I really know is it was a deep draft, and in the first round, the Oilers took a centerman from Bry Creek. Now, my aunt lived in Bry Creek for 14 years. So when the Oilers drafted Holloway, I quickly texted her and said, hey, do you know him or his family? And she wrote me back really quickly and said, no. Now, a few months ago, my wife and I decided to sign our 5-year-old son up for hockey. So we scrounged up a bunch of secondhand equipment just in time for the first practice, and he was ready to start living the dream. Well, he got out onto the ice and he fell down almost immediately. Ordinarily, he's able to get back onto his feet when he's skating, but with all this bulky equipment on for the first time, he was really struggling to get back up. I watched him wallow around out at center ice for about 5 minutes, and I could tell he was starting to get worked up. Well, eventually, he spotted me, and he starts to army crawl all the way down the rink to the section that I'm sitting in. But unfortunately, by the time he got there, one of the coaches finally spotted him and picked him up and took him all the way back to the bench. Well, at this point, my son is just losing his mind. Not only is he frustrated that he couldn't get back up, well, now this unknown masked stranger has just undid all the work he did trying to get over at me. So he storms off the ice and he's making his way around the rink. So I run and cut him off just before he gets to the point where the rubber ends and the concrete flooring begins. Now, my son is very stubborn. He gets it from his mother. And he has made up his mind that after only 15 minutes, his hockey career is now over. And he starts throwing an enormous fit. He is literally prostrate on the floor, kicking and screaming. And here's the thing, I am stuck in this spot dealing with his tantrum because of the COVID restrictions. I'm not allowed to walk him back to the bench and get him on the ice, but I'm also not going to take him to the change room and give in to his behavior and let him quit because it's hard. So I stood there in full view of all the other hockey parents for 25 minutes while my son allowed the dark side of the force to flow through him. But eventually he realized that causing a scene with his emotional outburst wasn't going to get him out of hockey practice, and he calmed down and got back out there. Now, a year ago, that young kid who is constantly trying to get that elusive booger out of his right nostril decided he didn't want to play for the Oilers anymore and demanded a trade. Old Kenny Ho didn't even flinch though. He let him go over to Europe and play. Eventually, like my son, JP had an epiphany that he wasn't going to get what he wanted and decided the best move for his career was to come back and play for the Oilers. I've always had mixed feelings about Puljujärvi, but there is definitely potential there. And if he actually has matured and he gets regular playing time with McDavid or Draisaitl, his contract for the next 2 years will be a massive bargain. Now, as for the other free agency signings, I'm going to tackle these in the order that they happened. I'm thrilled that Tyler Ennis is coming back. Outside of McDavid, Draisaitl, and Nugent Hopkins, he was the Oilers' best forward in the play-in round. Hopefully he is fully recovered from the injury he sustained during that series, though. I also like the Kyle Turris signing. He was on a really bloated contract in Nashville, and obviously he isn't the player he once was. I think this move gives them a little more flexibility in the top 9 and also another player to put on the power play. I will say that I'm disappointed that they didn't bring back Riley Sheahan. Edmonton's penalty kill was fantastic last year, and he was a huge part of it. Speaking of being disappointed, Did you know that Mike Smith is going to play more games in goal for the Oilers this year? Now, I have made my feelings about Smith abundantly clear for about 3 or 4 years now. Aside from his propensity to leave his crease and play the puck, he relies on reflexes rather than positioning to make saves. As he's gotten older, his response time has slowed, and his body gets hurt more frequently from the unanticipated rapid movements. So basically, you've got an old, broken down goalie who gets worse every year. But my worry is not Smith himself, but with Tippett's bias towards him. The coach gave him way too long of a leash last December, and the Oilers dipped out of a playoff spot for the only time all season by the end of his 3-week struggle. He also inexplicably started him in Game 1 versus the Blackhawks. In my opinion, there was zero justification for that move. But here's the thing. By the time they signed Smith, I really don't know what else they were going to do. I know they were in on the Markstrom sweepstakes, but I would have been equally upset if they had blown all that money in term on a soon-to-be 31-year-old goaltender with an injury history. And this isn't exclusive to Markstrom. I wouldn't give any goaltender more than a 3-year deal, other than Hellebuck, Vasilevsky, and Carter Hart. They're just far too volatile year to year. And most teams go with a tandem in net now anyway. I will say this. If the Oilers are going to make the playoffs this season, I can't imagine they finish the year with Smith as one of their starters. He's either going to get hurt or he won't be getting the job done and they will have to replace him. Speaking of getting hurt and bringing someone else in, Oscar Clefbaum is injured again and is going to miss the entire season, so Holland brought in Tyson Barrie. Now, Barrie absolutely cannot replace Clefbaum's importance to the team. I've spoken about this fact a number of times over the last 5 years. With Clefbaum in the lineup, the Oilers are a playoff team, and they are a lottery team without him. But I don't think for a second Barrie was brought in to replace Clefbaum. I think the idea here is that Barrie is going to rack up a ton of points, and Edmonton is going to rely on the development of their other defensemen to pick up the slack on the penalty kill and against top-line players. I'm not a huge fan of Barrie's game, but even with an abbreviated 56-game season, he is going to score the most points by an Oilers defenseman since Sheldon Surrey had 53 in 2008-09. Edmonton had one of the best power plays ever last season, and that was in spite of the fact that Clefbaum couldn't shoot with his bum shoulder bothering him. The threat of Barrie being able to one-time Draisaitl passes off the half wall is going to open up so much space for McDavid to receive cross-seam passes from him. Now, I've had some conflicted feelings about these signings, but no more than this last one. The Oilers have signed a solid depth scorer to a dirt cheap 1-year deal, and he just happens to have a German connection to Leon Draisaitl. Where have I heard that before?
Toby has been cruising for bruising for 12 years, and I am now his cruise director, and my name is Captain Bruisin.
Of all the idiots, in all the idiot villages, in all the idiot worlds, you stand alone. If I had a gun with 2 bullets and I was in a room with Hitler, Bin Laden, and Toby, I would shoot Toby twice.
So forgive me if I am not as optimistic or as excited about the acquisition of 25-year-old Dominic Cahoon. On the surface, this looks like a steal, but I will believe it when he scores a goal. Now, the final big addition the Oilers made this offseason was their reverse retro jersey. Now, I think the jersey is fine. They played it safe, but I would have preferred for them to bring back the Todd McFarlane gear jersey. This was the first crested jersey I ever bought, and seeing it makes me so nostalgic for the Mike Comrie, Anson Carter, Ryan Smith days from 2001 to 2003. I actually bought my son one, and needless to say, he was the sharpest looking kid out on the ice at his last practice before the restrictions shut down sports. Now, while I'm on the subject of restrictions, I am feeling more and more like I just don't have the time or the ability to do Oilers videos anymore. There are many reasons for this, and I don't feel I need to justify my decision, #boundaries, but out of respect for those of you who have been watching me regularly over the last 5 years, I'm going to briefly explain. First of all, I love making videos. Not only is it my profession, it's also my hobby. But I find that as my kids get older, I want to spend more and more time with them. They're only little for so long, and that time is precious to me. There is nothing I would sacrifice it for. Secondly, things in the sporting world change so quickly. There is a very small window where content is relevant. And I find that by the time I research, write, film, edit, and upload, the content's already been covered 3 ways to the weekend. And third, I don't pay nearly as much attention to the Oilers, the NHL, or even hockey for that matter, as I used to. When I was young, I literally knew every stat about every single player. People would constantly quiz me to see if they could stump me. I was known for my memory and hockey knowledge. Now, there's players in the league I've never even heard of. The point I'm trying to make is, I don't think it's fair to you, the audience, to sit there and have to listen to me preach to you about something that you probably know more about than I do. So it's not that I'm never going to make an Oilers video again, but if I do, it'll be the exception, not the rule. Thanks for listening. Have a wonderful Christmas and stay safe.